This is a virtual wheat tour. This is in lieu of our normal spring crop field day. We're going to be talking about the wheat in Southeast Kansas, and in particular the variety trials that we have at Southeast Research and Extension Center. James Coover, the agent for Wildcat District, is going to present wheat conditions in the state. Lonnie Mengarelli will talk about the wheat in the variety trials, and I'm Gretchen Sassenrath. I'm the cropping systems agronomist at Southeast Research and Extension Center. The format of the presentation today will be first to talk about the wheat conditions throughout the state or throughout the Southeast area, then the wheat varieties, and then Romulo Lollato, professor in wheat physiology, is going to be talking about the wheat varieties, and Erick De Wolf and Kelsey are going to be talking about wheat disease that we have, particularly strong in Southeast Kansas. First thing I want to start out with is it's the cumulative rainfall. This is for the water year that begins in October 1st, which pretty much covers the wheat growing season. And you can see we're pretty much right on track with where we were last year. Last year was a record-setting year, and we are just about there. We're only about 0.4 of an inch less. So we are very wet again this year, and that really impacts our wheat production. Now I'm going to turn it over to James Coover to talk about the wheat in Southeast area. James?
Hello. So the wheat in Southeast Kansas is a little bit, it looks a lot like it did last year, quite honestly. The amount of rain we've had, last year we had some very large rainfall events around this time frame, but this year we've actually had more rain earlier on and much more regular. And so in some ways we've had even more rain on the wheat than last year. So you can see a lot of yellowing in the waterways. With this picture here, you can see how up on the terrace channel, up on the terraces, the green wheat looks good. Down there in the waterways, you got a lot of yellow wheat. And this is very common throughout pretty much every field in Southeast Kansas. The more drainage a field has, the better the wheat looks. And it doesn't really matter too much of when the wheat was planted. We had two big time frames in the fall last year when wheat got planted. One around the good time, mid-October, and a lot of it didn't get planted till almost Thanksgiving. So there's a lot of variability when it comes to planting date, but when it came to it, it's a lot of the drainage in the field, how well it looks. A lot of this yellowing isn't necessarily nitrogen deficiency. Some of the tissue samples that we've seen, it's usually caused by just basically the root can't get enough oxygen rather than some sort of agronomic not applying enough nitrogen. Like Gretchen said, there's a lot of disease pressure in all of these fields, and it's been fairly evident how fast it's come on and that it's actually moving up fairly quickly into the upper leaves. Even earlier on, it was easy to see the unevenness within a field, and it was very splotchy. Some wheat grew really well, some wheat didn't, and you could tell that in the height now that it's come to heading too. Some wheat is only a few inches tall, and it's headed, and right next to wheat that's a normal height. As far as diseases, you can see pretty much everything across the board. Stripe rust there's a fair amount of it around. Erick De Wolf will probably show his stripe rust pictures later on. It doesn't look like Southeast Kansas is hit as hard, but a lot of that has to do with reporting more than what the actual conditions are. And you could see here, we got a lot of tan spot, we got a lot of septoria. It kind of depends on what the field history is, how strong those are, and the variety resistance. We had some powdery mildew earlier on. You kind of see a lot less of that now that it's kind of heated up a little bit. But this field, for instance, is very common, and all fields, of course, are very sparse in comparison to some years. There's light hitting the ground pretty easily in some of these fields, and it's sort of two areas. There's a very wide difference when it comes to a lot of these fields. Some fields look great, if they had a lot of good drainage, they're planted at the right time. I mean, those yields could, probably expecting around 60 to 70 bushels, not too bad for this area. But a lot of fields, however, that were planted late or they had not enough drainage, I mean, those yields are looking around 30 to 40 if they're lucky. So it's kind of two different worlds come when these fields look. I mean, they might average together, they might look fine when you average all those numbers together, but that's not really the reality of the wheat situation here.
Thank you, James. Now we're going to move to Lonnie and talking about the variety trials.
All right, this year we actually got wheat in on time this year and had a good stand. They were planted October 23rd. That 1.2 million seeds per acre. Conventional tillage, we put on a pre-plant of a 50-40-6-30. Nitrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Planted them on 7-inch rows. And then again in February, I top dressed it with another 60-46-30. That particular day, I started top dressing on frozen ground about 7:30 in the morning. At 10 o'clock when I finished up, I was starting to leave pretty significant tracks in the field, even with an empty fertilizer cart. But it ended up working out pretty good for us this year. So we have 15 this year. Our test consists of 15 hard varieties, 2 from AgriMaxx, Cartwright, and Eastwood, 2 from AgriPro Benefit and Grit, 3 from AGSECO, the Icon, an experimental, and then of course TAM 205, which has been the test for quite a while too. From Kansas State, we had Everest and Zenda. From Oklahoma, we had Smith's Gold. And of course, Rockstar's back this year. And then WestBred, we had 4, 4269, 4303, 4401, and 4699. This year we did we went out and did an estimated yield using the K-State wheat yield estimator, which is basically counting how many heads per foot times multiplied by a factor and then divided by the row spacing. I believe a lot of these numbers are high. I think potentially some of these could be right on, but overall I don't expect to harvest this much wheat per acre, this many bushels. You know, I'm expecting 60 in the really good places, you know, and like James said, 40 to 50 in others. So this year we had 10 soft varieties. AgriMaxx had 4, the 415, 473, 503, 505. Then we had an experimental, I think that's an experimental, out of Oklahoma. It looks really good. And then Pioneer, of course, we've had all those varieties for several years now, and they seem to be pretty established and do very well. And then we also did the yield estimates on these. Other than the experimental, I wouldn't be surprised with these kinds of numbers with the way the wheat looks. So, and especially being in Southeast Kansas with soft wheat and being able to handle wetter conditions, I'm kind of excited to see what soft wheat does this year.
Okay, yeah, so we have this list of wheat varieties of the hard red ones that we will get a little bit more in depth into each one of them and discuss their adaptability in the region and their performance and the need for fungicide or not. So together with Erick De Wolf and Kelsey Andersen there, we'll go over some of these varieties. So Gretchen, maybe we can go for the first one, AM Cartwright. Yeah, so AM Cartwright, this is actually a new variety out of AgriMaxx. Actually, this was a line that was within K-State, the Manhattan breeding program K-State here. This AM Cartwright, and then it was licensed out to AgriMaxx. As a background, this variety it shares a parent with Bob Dole, right? It gives you an idea there of the type of variety that it might actually turn out being. It has a very good straw strength on Cartwright here, and a very decent behavior on acid soils as well. So as far as straw strength and acid soils, that's actually quite well. Now, it's going to be a little bit later than what we have in Bob Dole. Remember, Bob Dole being a medium early one. Cartwright's going to be more of a medium maturity one. And it did not keep up with yield as much as Bob Dole did in the past couple of years here, where Bob Dole just had a tremendous performance. Cartwright was not quite there, but it did very similarly to SY Monument as far as yield record goes, which is one of the most used varieties around the state of Kansas, right? So decent yield performance there, comparable to SY Monument, good acid soils, good quality as well on this one. And Eric, if I remember right, this one is pretty decent on leaf and stripe rust, or has this changed this year?
Yeah, so one of the things going on disease-wise is that it seems like the population of stripe rust, leaf rust are changing somewhat within the region, and that is affecting some of our varieties. We've not had a lot of chance to be out looking just yet this field season, so we're scrambling a little bit to find information, but fortunately we do have some great collaborations with the USDA unit here in Manhattan. And they put out what we call a rust nursery, where we have small plots of a lot of these different wheat varieties. And in that particular nursery focused on stripe rust, the AM Cartwright looked pretty good. So it looked like it was above average or moderately resistant to the current races of stripe rust. So I think that's a big plus for Cartwright, and probably will help it take some acres in parts of southeast Kansas.
Okay, coming up next here, we have another AgriMaxx variety, Eastwood. So Eastwood, we have had the chance to take a look at it now for at least a good 2 or 3 years in several Kansas locations. Looking at the yield performance of Eastwood in southeast Kansas in particular, it seems to have been doing okay. I mean, it seems to have been consistently kind of like above average. If we look at the last 3 years or so, that gives us, well, at least looking at the last 2 years, it has been considerably above the average there. On Eastwood here, we have an early maturing variety, a pretty good straw strength on it, very upright type of leaf type as well. If you look into the canopy there, you want to make sure that you have a good population establishment on this one, so increasing the seeding rates there. It is relatively short, right? So it's a medium short variety that helps with its standability as well. Pretty decent winter hardness on this one. And Kelsey AM Eastwood is one that we typically say that might be an option there on those acres following corn, although it might not be the best scab resistance that we have out there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's not the best option for scab resistance compared to Zenda or Everest, some of the others we have here in the portfolio. But yeah, so especially in our Kansas State trials, it is performed a little worse than average. So that's definitely something to consider in this part of Kansas. And also the other watchouts would be leaf rust and stripe rust. It can be pretty susceptible. I don't know if we're seeing that there in those plots and those photos, but this might be one where a fungicide application would really help it along.
Very well. Coming up next here, we have a Syngenta variety, SY Benefit. So Benefit, Syngenta has been putting out as a variety that is adapted more to that eastern part of the state. So east of Highway 81 or I-35. And so southeast Kansas might be where Benefit has a home there. The background of Benefit there, it has Jagaline and Art on the S parents. It's pretty decent on low soil pH, which can be important there in southeast Kansas. Very good on milling and baking quality here as well. And it does have soil-borne mosaic virus. An early to medium early maturing variety. The yield record on Benefit in central Kansas, it has not been too great. I mean, it has been towards the south central Kansas, has been towards the kind of the lower end of the trials there. In southeast Kansas, it seems to have been a little bit more there on average, or maybe a little bit above average there. Maybe it's that that slightly resistance that it might have to head scab there as well. Would you say, Eric? Would you agree with that? Can benefit it in that region?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. So I think compared to Zenda or Everest, this one's maybe not quite at that level of fusarium resistance, but it does seem like it's in that intermediate category. So This one would be a possibility for that area. However, I do see a fair degree of susceptibility to leaf rust. Not too bad on the stripe rust, moderately resistant there. So if we're willing to manage it for some of the other leaf diseases, there may be a possibility of SY Benefit adding to the lineup here in the Southeast.
Up next, we have SY Grit. So Grit, just to give a little bit of a background there, it's derived from the variety Post Rock. And Post Rock gives you an idea of the general adaptability for that variety, right? Post Rock in the north central part of the state. So really, whenever I think of Grit, I think of a variety that is more for those type of like a north central to northwest type of conditions there. It has a pretty decent amount of drought tolerance, so it handles those drought tolerant drought conditions quite well of north central Kansas there. One of the concerns that I would have with Grit in southeast Kansas would be low soil pH. This is one that is very, very susceptible to low soil pH. And so if you have acid soils or pH less than probably 5.5 or something along those lines, SY Grit can already start showing it and have a pretty hard yield hit there. So that's the biggest concern that I would have with Grit in the southeast part of the state. It has a pretty good straw strength and some other things that might be good traits for southeast Kansas, but again, that acid soil tolerance, it really would make me a little bit concerned of pushing Grit too hard there. I think it's out of its area of adaptation. Would you agree with that, Kelsey?
I think so. I think especially, again, we're talking about Fusarium head blight, but that is important in this area, and it is a little more susceptible than average, so that's important. And this one is pretty susceptible to leaf rust and stripe rust. And I did see this in the nursery this week, and it did have quite a lot of stripe rust on it, so that's an important consideration. Maybe a fungicide is necessary if you plant this particular variety in that region. So those are some key watch outs.
In Gretchen here, we have next, AG Icon. Okay, I thought we had that experimental before there, but yeah, let's go for AG Icon because we would skip that the experimental anyways, right? So AG Icon, this is another one that was coming down the K-State pipeline, and then it was actually licensed to AgSECO. If you know LCS Chrome, right, it has been around for a while. AG Icon is a sister to Chrome. Really, they share some parentage there. It really is 3 to 4 days earlier though, so Chrome is a pretty late maturing variety. AG Icon is going to be more of that medium category. It's a good 3 to 4 days earlier than what we have in Chrome. It has a pretty decent straw strength, so it handles the straw actually quite well. Doesn't do very well with drought, so I think the region where we're going to see AG Icon do well is really central Kansas and east. I think from the leaf health perspective, it might be okay out there for southeast Kansas, but Eric, perhaps head scab would be a concern on this one.
I think that's right. So again, nothing special there on the head scab side, moderately susceptible, very right on par with where most of our hard red wheat varieties lie. It does have some resistance to leaf rust and stripe rust, and kind of curious how it will stack up against these new types of stripe rust that are on the move in the region here. Also quite vulnerable to barley yellow dwarf, which we know can also be a problem there in the southeast corridor. So kind of curious how this one will perform in this year and a higher disease year there in the southeast.
So I don't have much information on this experimental from AgSECO here. I don't know if anybody else on the call has any information on it. Based on Ronnie's yield estimate there, it seems to be looking really good. But I don't have much information on the agronomic on this one or any background on it.
It looks like we got a little bit of a sneak peek at this one in the USDA nursery, and we rated it intermediate to moderately susceptible to stripe rust and not too bad on leaf rust. I think Kelsey had some notes that she took earlier in the week, and Hutch experiment field on this one.
Okay, TAM 205. So this is actually a brand new release out of Texas A&M. We first, I believe it was actually released this year. Some of the interesting things about TAM 205 here is that it has a FHB1 gene, which of course Kelsey or Eric are going to expand on that. Probably a pretty decent reaction to head scab there. Despite being a variety from Texas A&M out there, really the adaptability for this one, they're putting it as I-70 and South. So a variety that has a pretty broad and pretty wide adaptability throughout the region. They're putting it as either a grain only, but from grain only all the way to heavy grazing. So that might be another thing that of interest there in Southeast Kansas. And since you have a pretty good standability, they're putting it, if you're irrigating, which I don't think is the case there in Southeast Kansas, but very high yield potential under those conditions. One comment on TAM 205, it does have a pretty large seed, looks like. So just watch out for population. If growers are planting in pounds per acre, they might need to adjust that to make sure that they have enough population out there. Otherwise, they might result in some pretty thin stands. But Eric, this FHB1 gene for head scab, how much can we expect that to benefit this variety?
Well, that FHB1 is going to be targeted at Fusarium head blight or head scab. And it's kind of interesting that a resistance gene that's probably more common in some of the spring wheat areas where they've also been dealing with this Fusarium head blight disease for the last couple decades. This is the first time we've seen FHB1 make it to an agronomically competitive variety in our region. So I'm kind of curious how it's going to stack up, particularly if some of our high-risk situations for Fusarium head blight do materialize this year. It'll be our first chance to get some direct experience with TAM 205. We also had a chance to look at this one in some of the rust screening nurseries, and it looked like it was hanging in there pretty well, moderately resistant to resistant, better than most. Yeah, so far, this looks like one that we might keep on our radar as we head into harvest.
Okay, well, Everest, I don't think this needs much introduction for the growers in Southeast Kansas. As far as a hard red winter wheat goes, it's been the predominant one in the region for several years here. A release back from 2009, Everest has had many thousands of acres across Kansas throughout the years. Some of the agronomic attributes that made it successful in a large portion of the state, and perhaps even more so in Southeast Kansas. Maturity, so it is an early maturing variety. So that means that whenever we have some heat stress later in the growing season, Everest might already be past some of those more susceptible stages and can kind of escape from that heat. Very good acid soil tolerance as well. So it handles low soil pH to a considerable amount, perhaps 5.2 or 5. It can still do quite well comparatively to other varieties. Very good standability as well. So whenever growers are willing to really push fertility and things along these lines and really go for like higher yields, Everest has that standability to keep up with those higher fertility levels. With that said, it's one that we probably need to be looking for a fungicide application, depending on the disease that is prevalent in the season there. But Kelsey, perhaps could you give me more details for us there on the disease package for Everest?
Yeah, and maybe someone can jump in and comment and on what's going on in those leaves in that particular plot. Are we looking at tan spot there, or does anyone have a guess that saw those plots? If not, that's okay.
There's a lot of stripe rust and some tan spot in that for sure.
Is that so? That's kind of, I think, what we would expect, particularly in these high disease areas. So Everest is great because it has that best-in-class Fusarium head blight resistance, some of the best we have in this area. Similar to Zenda, though, so again, that might be the better option. But I think we've seen now consistently that this is very susceptible to stripe rust. We're seeing that in our nurseries, and we're seeing that out in the field, like you can see in this image here. So that's the big red flag for this variety, particularly in Southeast Kansas, I think.
Zenda. So Zenda was released again 2 or 3 years ago as a replacement for Everest, and it does have Everest on its background, right? So that gives you an idea of the type of environment and everything that it will be adapted. And really, it's showing a very good performance in the same region where Everest has shown good performance as well, which includes central Kansas through the southeast part of the state there. So some of the things here, if you're used to growing Everest, what are some of the differences that you can expect from Zenda here? It's going to be a few days later. So if we have an early maturing variety in Everest, we have a medium early in Zenda. It's going to be a little bit taller as well. So Everest will be like a medium short variety. Zenda is probably going to be more on that medium side. Standability is excellent though. So although it's a little bit taller, it's going to stand just as well as Everest, and a great acid soil tolerance there as well. It seems to be pretty stable yielding variety here based on what we have observed in our own trials. Many times yielding quite well, even in the absence of a fungicide application there. And in the opposite, the flip side of that, we don't see much of a response, right? Whenever we're putting out that fungicide, at least for the last few years, we haven't. But if we look at the K-State trials in South Central Kansas, Zenda has been consistently out-yielding Everest in 3, maybe 4 bushels per acre for the last few years. If we look at Southeast Kansas, they are a little bit more unfair there. I think maybe there is, if you look at the last 3 years, 19, 18, and 17, we had a total of 4 trials only. And Zenda was about a bushel and a half more than Everest in Southeast Kansas. So perhaps not the same advantage that we see in Central Kansas, but perhaps a little bit of an advantage there as well. Eric, what about the disease package on Zenda?
Yeah, I think Zenda brings forward a lot of the desirable characteristics out of Everest. You talked a lot about its above average yields, maybe a little better than where we've been with Everest for a while. So this would be one of my top picks for this area of the state. Part of the reasons for that is related to its better than average fusarium head blight resistance, so very comparable to what we're used to in for FHB and in the Everest. It also has comparable levels of barley yellow dwarf resistance to Everest, maybe not quite as strong there as we've come to expect out of Everest, but certainly better than most. And I think one of the big step forwards here is addressing that stripe rust resistance issue that had really emerged in Everest over the last few years. So you can see in the contrast of the leaves here, wow, what a difference some genetic resistance will make to stripe rust in a high disease pressure situation. So with that, one little caveat there, we are been picking up a little bit more stripe rust on Zenda. So I think I would be picking this one over Everest, but I'd also would keep an eye on that stripe rust and make sure we don't get any surprises going into the next field season.
Our next one here is from Oklahoma State University, Smith's Gold. So OSU has for many years had a variety that took several thousand acres of wheat in Kansas, which was Gallagher. And Smith's Gold comes as a replacement for Gallagher, and it has Gallagher on its background. So let's give an overview of these 2 varieties and some of the differences between them here very briefly. They're both very decent on acid soil conditions, so that makes them kind of well adapted to that region there. Hash and fly, both of them share a good amount of resistance to hash and fly. Smith's Gold will be a step up there because it also offers some resistance to green bug. Smith's Gold is going to be a little bit earlier in heading as we compare between Smith's Gold and Gallagher. It's going to be a little bit earlier heading than we had in Gallagher, but a little bit later first hollow stem. So it means that it holds winter dormancy a little bit longer, and then it takes on spring growth faster. So that later first hollow stem gives growers some extra days to graze during the spring, right? And many times those 7 extra days or 10 extra days can produce a considerable amount of beef there. I think that's an overview. If you look at the yield record in Oklahoma, they have been very similar. Gallagher and Smith's Gold have been very similar yield levels. In Kansas, we still see a little advantage for Gallagher. So it hasn't really out yielded Gallagher yet when we look at Smith's Gold, but that data is more for South Central Kansas. I was not able to find data on Smith's Gold for Southeast Kansas. So the closest that we can get there would be that data from probably South Central Kansas. But so again, a little bit more of maybe a grazing type of wheat, but the yield not quite as there. Kelsey, what do you think of Smith's Gold disease package?
Yeah, I think the big thing to watch out for here, and I'm wondering if I'm seeing it in this plot right now, would be Fusarium head blight. So it is susceptible, a strong susceptible to Fusarium head blight. And it's also susceptible to tan spot, so that leaf spotting disease that can start in the lower canopy and in residue, and then move up into the upper leaves and cause considerable yield damage. So those are the big ones to watch out for. It's been performing pretty well in our stripe rust and leaf rust nurseries. So that's one of the big positives for Smith's Gold. So as long as it can, as long as you can avoid Fusarium head blight, maybe avoiding corn and considering a fungicide application, if the weather's conducive around flowering, then this could be a good option.
Polansky Rockstar. So this one, we got to see it for the first time, I believe it was last year. So again, another brand new release out there. So we don't have a whole lot of direct experience with Rockstar, but some of the things that we've learned here, it does seem to be somewhat similar to what we have in SY Monument as far as maturity goes. So maybe just a day earlier in maturity than what we have in Monument. So probably that medium to medium late category out there. It seems to be pretty decent on acid soils and a pretty good straw strength as well here for Rockstar. Medium height, right? With Monument, we have maybe a medium tall. This is going to be kind of like more of a medium height. Another important difference between this one and Monument is that Monument it has probably a better drought tolerance, so it moves out west more. But Rockstar here seems to move out east a little bit better as well. So it seems like central and eastern Kansas is the area where Polansky is kind of suggesting that this variety is more adapted. And Eric, I've heard him saying that this might be an improvement in head scab there, but I don't know if we have any of our own ratings or not.
Yeah, I think that's one that I've been watching here too. I think Rockstar has looked good in the USGA's stripe rust, leaf rust screening nurseries, so that's a big plus for us. Definitely at the top of the class there. I've definitely heard that discussion from Polansky that it does appear to, in some of their information, have reasonable resistance to Fusarium head blight, but I just haven't had a chance to see it under some of our heavy disease screening or high risk type of areas. So be interesting to see. This year we may be able to get some good notes and experience, maybe even out of this Parsons location.
Okay, I think we're moving into the WestBred varieties now. So WB4303. So yield record there in Southeast Kansas, last 3 years, 4 trials. It has been a little bit below the average there, very close to the average as far as performance goes for yield in Southeast Kansas. So what are some of the agronomics on this variety here? It is an early maturing variety. So the WestBred numbering system, if we look at that, the 4, it's going to tell us the type of wheat. So the 4 just tells us that it is a hard red winter wheat. 2 tells us maturity. So 2 being an early maturing one, and if it was 7 or 8 or 9, that would be a later maturing variety. The third number, as of now, not in this case, but it gives us the year of release, starting in 2019. So if you had a 9 there, it would have been 2019 release. And the last number is just a random one. So adaptability for this variety, again, it's going to be central and eastern Kansas. That's based on what WestBred is putting in it. It does have a pretty good straw strength, so that's a plus there for those growers Southeast Kansas who might actually push it for use a little bit more early heading, and I think pretty decent on acid soils there. And one thing to keep in mind here is that it is a certified seed-only variety, CSO. So you need to buy seed every year. That's something to consider if you're willing to purchase the seed every year. But Kelsey, it seems like a head scab has been, this one has been holding one decently as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially for Southeast Kansas, this would be a good option for fusarium head blight management. It's been fairly moderately resistant in our screens, and then also according to WestBred. So that's coupled along with just a generally nice disease package. So this one we've been seeing a good amount, react pretty well in our striped rust and leaf rust nurseries. So it has just a solid package there. Just one watch out would be tan spot. So your leaves might not be completely clean, but and wheat streak mosaic virus, that's another one that it's pretty susceptible to. But again, if fusarium head blight is a concern, or this is going in after corn in those high residue fields where that pathogen really likes to live, this might be a really good option.
Okay, interesting that we have these two varieties back to back here, because they derive their yield from different ways here. So the 4269 that we were talking about until now, it puts out a lot of feelers and it puts out a lot of small heads. That's where the yield comes from. Whereas 4303 here, take a look at the head size there. It puts out less heads, but it's just a bigger head, a longer head, like not uncommon to see 18 or even 20 meshes in each one of those heads. So a different way that they're building their yield. Okay, what can we talk about 4303 here? 4303 has done quite well in many of those trials where we're pushing the trial for yield, so intensively managed trials. That means more fertilizer there, really going up on the nitrogen rate and making sure that the crop is protected with a fodder fungicide. In those conditions, 4303 tends to thrive. It has an excellent straw strength. It has actually a very, very thick straw and excellent straw strength that can handle those higher fertility conditions. It's an early maturing variety, at least as a heading goes, but then it takes a longer time to go through the grain field. So it heads early, but then grain fielding is a little bit longer than some of the others out there. Pretty good on acid soils, very good milling and baking as well. This is another one that has a large seed, so you might want to watch out for the seed size there. So if you're planting in plants per acre, or sorry, in seed, pounds of seed per acre, you really want to watch out your seed size, because this can be quite large and you end up with thinner stems. And this is one that tends to benefit from the higher population a little bit. At least that's what we're seeing in some of the trials. So, and Eric, we're talking about intensive management and perhaps being a fit in those acres, but then we really talking about the fodder fungicide, right? And maybe scab can be a pretty big concern for this one in Southeast.
Yeah, I think so. I think you really hit it on the head there. Definitely, if we're going to push this one for yield and take advantage of that good yield potential and on intensive weed management, we want to make sure that it does include a fungicide in our management plan. So high degree of susceptibility to stripe rust, tan spot, and some other foliar diseases. So across the board, at best intermediate to moderately susceptible to most of our leaf diseases. Also keep an eye on fusarium head blight. This one is at least in that moderately susceptible to susceptible category. So we've seen this one get dinged pretty bad at some locations where FHB has been active. So probably would only consider this one in Southeast if we're planning to use one of the top shelf fungicide products in that higher management type of scenario.
Okay, WB 4401. I don't think I've seen this variety much yet, at least personally. I don't have a whole lot of experience with 4401. If I remember right, they were putting this variety as a good forage potential. So perhaps for those growers who go for a dual purpose in that region, might be an option. And if I'm not mistaken, Eric and Kelsey, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're also suggesting a good head scab on this one. But again, I don't have much information on these. WestBred also suggests that you should use a growth regulator with this one, which tells me that maybe the straw strength is not as strong as what we have in 4269 or 4303. But again, I don't have much experience with these ones. With this one, Eric and Kelsey, do you guys have much?
Well, no, since this is new, we haven't seen it very much, and I'm curious to see how it shakes out in some of our K-State Fusarium head blight screens, because it is promoted by WestBred as being moderately resistant, so that's a key trait. We did see it in our stripe rust nursery, and it performed intermediately, so just about average for both stripe and leaf rust. So it might have just a solid disease package, but some susceptibility. But like you said, we're going to have to keep looking at this one and see how it handles, especially these high disease pressure areas. It will be really interesting to learn more.
Okay, I think this takes us to our last of the hard reds here, and it's WB4699. So this is another one that WestBred positions as more like a east of Highway 81 or I-35 there, or east. So more of an eastern variety. Pretty good standability on this one. So again, seems like WestBred has been working that out in most of their varieties, perhaps with that 4401 as an exception there, but working that out as a standability as a very good trait there. The maturity on this one is going to be a little bit later, as we see by that 46. It is a 2019 release out there. So WestBred is putting this one as an option for a later maturing variety after corn. But before we go there real quick here, we need to just mention that in some of the screenings that Alan Fritz is doing for acid soil tolerance, this one did not look too strong, right? It was actually a little bit more susceptible than we were anticipating for acid soils there. So that might be something to keep an eye on, that we might need a little bit more a few more years of data there to really have a feeling of how this goes against that acid soil conditions. But Eric, what about head scab on this one?
Yeah, this is one that, again, WestBred is promoting as being above average on the Fusarium head blight. So from that perspective, that's an important characteristic there in the southeast portion of the state. So I'm curious how this one will do. Looks like it was struggling a little bit in some of our rust screening so far this year. So I think this would be one to keep an eye on because of that Fusarium head blight resistance. It may ultimately need a fungicide to control some of its leaf disease susceptibility.
Excellent. Yeah, and of course that southeast corner of the state would be the only part of the state really where we would be able to grow soft red winter wheat. Those wheats that are more bred in regions like, well, in the soft wheat growing region like Virginia and even Missouri and other places in the eastern side of the U.S. there. So we don't have much. I don't have much information on these soft red varieties here. We can make probably, Gretchen, a few comments there of what we're seeing as far as difference in performance in soft versus hard and their stability as well. And perhaps you can go and slowly go forward with those pictures as we're talking about that, just so folks know how these varieties look like there. But really, whenever we're comparing soft and hard winter wheat, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is soft and what is hard, right? And really, the kernel hardness is really defined as how compacted those starch molecules are within that wheat kernel. If they're very, very highly compacted like this, then it's going to result in a hard kernel that once it goes through the milling process, it breaks those starch molecules there and probably requiring more water for that end product. If it is a soft wheat, then whenever those starch molecules, they are not as tightly bound within the wheat kernel. Whenever it goes through the milling process, many of those starch molecules end up being whole, and so probably with less water you get to the same product that you need there. But going about and very briefly here discussing yields on these ones and how it compared overall. The soft wheat, it has a yield advantage over the hard wheat for a couple of different reasons there. And we looked at about 20 years of data there in southeast Kansas to make this comparison. So the first primary reason there that we have is that the soft wheats, they have less protein, right? And so protein is a very expensive compound to produce. If you need to produce less protein, you can put more resources building up starch, and so you have a higher yield potential. So think about it, for the same amount of units of water or for the same amount of units of solar radiation that we have, if the wheat is producing a cheaper produce, then it can produce more of it, right? So that's essentially the reason why, one of the reasons why soft wheat kind of out yields hard wheat. The cheaper product because it has less protein. Another thing that we looked at and we also found there in Southeast Kansas was that it seems like the soft wheats had a little bit more stability when the conditions were very wet, right? So we did a stability analysis there, and it seems like if the conditions were very wet, the soft yields were still quite stable, but and conditions in Southeast Kansas, they are towards that side of very wet, as you guys described in the beginning of this call, very often. And so it seems like in those conditions, when we have too much moisture, they can have a little bit more stability of yield there, whereas some of these hard reds, they kind of tend to lose yield on those conditions more often. Of course, it's the other way around. If we talk about dry conditions, the hard ones, they tend to be more stable. And I guess, Gretchen, the last thing that we found whenever we were taking a look at this and trying to compare was that wheat breeding programs in the soft wheat growing region, they were able to have a higher rate of yield gain, right? So because they are breeding in a higher yielding environment and they are not breeding necessarily for the same quality standards that we are breeding in the hard region environment, well, that allows those breeding programs to have a higher rate of yield gain. So we would expect newer varieties to have higher yield potential, even higher yield potential than what we have in those in new varieties coming out of the red program. So those are the three main reasons there, Gretchen, that we discussed on soft wheat out yielding red wheats in the southeast part of the state, right? So I definitely think the producers out there, they need to take advantage of that opportunity of growing either or, and take the decision based on price, and take the decision based on, of course, input costs and where they're going to market that grain.
There's another major reason I've heard is because of the disease package, that soft wheat tends to not have all the sensitivities to the diseases as the hard red. Eric or Kelsey, could you address that?
Sure. I think like Romulo was talking about there, it does seem like the soft wheats are a little more robust or stable in some of these wetter environments. And lots of times that has to do with their being bred or selected in environments that are a little higher moisture and a little more prone to disease than some of our red wheats, so our hard red wheats. So I would not be all that surprised. There's been a lot more progress made on some of the resistance to fusarium head blight. So again, in the southeast portion of the state, that's a big plus. It'd be kind of interesting to look at a few more of these pictures, Gretchen. I noticed that in the disease screening nurseries that we were looking at, striped rust and leaf rust, some of our pioneer varieties looked like they were showing some susceptibilities there. The 25R50 we're showing as moderately susceptible, so we're still in that. Okay. 25R40 was kind of intermediate. So.
Another question I had was, here's 25R40 and here's 25R50. 25R50 is beardless. What advantage does that give? You can see there's some disease on the leaves here. But how does the beardless quality impact disease?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a strong correlation with disease. Sometimes I've heard different breeders discuss, and it seems like in the dry environments where we tend to grow our hard red wheat varieties, it seems like breeders have discussed that having the beard or those awns seems to give them just a little bit of a bump in a yield, where it seems like the opposite is true in the soft wheats, where breeders discussing these varieties have said they just don't see that kind of advantage over on varieties in the soft regions. So kind of mixed reviews on the role of awns or beards in these. It does seem like as I've worked in different soft wheat areas or with these varieties, the awnless or beardless varieties are much more common in the soft red wheat region.
Yes, we've got a couple of them in the variety test. So this is 25R50, and then here's another Pioneer, and you can see there's a lot of disease just in this picture.
Yeah, for sure.
Whereas this one is much cleaner.
Yeah, like Eric mentioned, though, I just don't think there's a clear link between, for example, having less awns and less disease, or more awns and more disease. It's really genetics specific. So we just don't see those. It would be nice if it was clear cut like that, right, Eric? But I don't think there's quite that kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's for sure. I don't think there's a clear genetic link to resistance that I'm aware of.
Here I've got some pictures of these canopies. I don't have, I think some of them I do have labeled. This is obviously rust, and we had quite a bit of infection this year.
Which one was that in? That was in the...
I did not take the, when I was taking the picture, I didn't have a map, so I don't know which cultivars that's in. After a rain, this yellow stuff is the spores, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
After a rain, are those washed off?
Yeah, stripe rust is kind of interesting that way. Is I would be surprised if those spores that are ideally spread just by wind are not knocked off by rain, and the impact of raindrops probably does wash a lot of them down into the lower canopy and even onto the soil surface. Interestingly, with stripe rust, one of the things that's kind of interesting is we often see these patches or hot spots of stripe rust developing early in the season. And based on some reading that I've been doing, it sounds like these spores of the fungus are covered in a sticky substrate that allows them to stick to leaf surfaces, but they also tend to clump together when conditions are very humid. So we tend, because of that, they don't move very far when they go through the dispersal process by wind, or they're not moved very far because the masses of spores are a little more dense. So I think it's kind of interesting that I think there's a couple interactions with the environment there, like you mentioned, Gretchen, that rain can wash a lot of spores down to the soil, but they also favor the humidity that will favor a new generation of spores. But the humidity interaction and the effect on spore clumping, I think, explains part of how we get these hot spots or small foci of stripe rust early in the growing season.
Okay, good. For me, I can always tell the rust because it's above the leaf surface, whereas tan spot is like in the leaf, if you will, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But when I went out, we've had so much rain, so many days of rain. We went out right after a rain, and I didn't see that orange fuzziness. But it's like, I know there was rust there before, but it's like the rust is gone. But I think that's what had just happened. The rain washed it off. So you had the lesions on the plant, but not the fuzzy stuff, if you will, or the spores.
You'll see that same phenomenon if there's a fungicide application. So the fungicide will actually kill the fungus, so it might, knock down that spore production, but you'll still see those empty lesions. Basically, that damage will still be done to the leaf. And there's also, for stripe rust, maybe Eric can talk more about this, but different varieties will have different reactions. So they'll look visually very different. So like a very susceptible variety might get this full reaction where you have full sporulation all across the leaf there. But then some of the more resistant varieties, they might not sporulate as much. So you might still get some lesions, some striping, some yellowing of the leaf, but they won't have as much sporulation, and then they won't spread as much to the neighboring plants. So sometimes based on the variety susceptibility, you'll have a slightly different reaction.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I was really surprised about how varieties right next to each other, one would be really infected and one wasn't. I mean, it's really obvious, the varietal differences.
Mhm.
This one is the, I think, I'm assuming it's some kind of experimental. Is that gloom blotch? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah, it definitely looks like it. I think you've got a couple different things here going. It looks like some of the edges of the glooms are getting a little bit darker, maybe towards the tip, right at the base of the awn, like your cursor is pointing to. And that's a couple possibilities. Could be gloom blotch. There's also a bacterial disease called black chaff, which is a xanthomonas type of bacteria that can also cause some leaf diseases that I know have been problematic and historically in the southeast portion of the state. Also a little bit lower, the head directly below it, looks like there's some fusarium head blight or head scab that we've been talking about or touched on multiple times, both maybe gloom blotch and that fusarium present in the same experimental variety.
Okay. And I think this is also gloom blotch, I think, in Zenda. That's what I was thinking. The same kind of darkening of the,
Yeah, sure could be.
okay. And here is kind of more typical fusarium head blight. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that's kind of a classic symptom there where you have a little bit darkened spikelet or mesh right there in the middle of the head. And then as the fungus moves into the central portion of the head called the rachis, it cuts off flow of nutrients within that head, and the entire upper portion of that particular head has died off just because of flow of water and nutrients has caused premature death of the remaining portions of the head.
Okay, great. Well, I really want to thank you guys so much. Thank Romulo for pulling these together, and Erick and Kelsey, Erick De Wolf and Kelsey Andersen for joining us today. Stu's name was on it, so I left his name on there. He's not on us on today. Really appreciate this. This was a great opportunity to get together and talk.